Abigail Whitmore had already picked up her suitcase when she said it not as a plea, not as an apology, but as the only truth she had left to offer a world that had never once asked for more than what her body looked like. "No one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook." The words landed in the middle of Willow Creek's dusty main street like a stone dropped into still water. Every person within earshot went quiet. And Ethan Caldwell, 6 feet of weathered silence, hat-in-hand dust on his boots, looked at her for a long moment without saying anything at all. If you love stories about women who rise, despite being broken down, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and let's begin. The summer of 1884 hit the Montana Territory like a punishment. By 10 in the morning, the dirt roads of Willow Creek baked under a sky that offered no mercy, and the women standing outside Pearson's general store fanned themselves with their handkerchiefs and talked in the low, certain voices of people who had long since decided what they knew about everyone around them. Abigail Whitmore stood apart from all of it. She had arrived on the 7 o'clock stage from Bozeman, with one leather suitcase, a small coin purse, and a folded piece of paper that listed the name of the man who had posted the notice in the Bozeman Courier 3 weeks prior. The notice had said, "Cook wanted. Caldwell Ranch, Willow Creek, Montana. Room and wages provided. Inquire by post. Ethan Caldwell, proprietor." She had written him a letter. He had written back. And now she was here standing on the boards outside the general store in the full August heat, waiting for a man she had never met, while every woman in Willow Creek made their quiet assessment of her from across the street. Abigail was 25 years old. She had a round, soft face and long chestnut hair she kept pinned beneath a simple straw bonnet. Her eyes were warm brown, the kind that caught light without trying. She wore a blue cotton dress, plain and clean and pressed, and she held herself with a stillness that some women develop when they have learned that drawing attention never works in their favor. She was also, by any honest accounting, a large woman, curvy in every direction, heavy in a way that small towns in 1884 did not pretend to overlook. "Lord," said a woman named Mrs. Holt, wife of the hardware merchant Chin, sharp as a boot heel, to the woman beside her. "Is that the one who answered Ethan's notice?" "Apparently," said the other woman. "He'll send her back on the afternoon stage. If he's polite about it." They were not quiet enough. Abigail heard every syllable. She kept her eyes on the far end of the street and her grip steady on the handle of her suitcase, and she did not give them the satisfaction of flinching. She had been hearing things like that her whole life. She had grown up in Bozeman, the second of 4 children raised by a grandmother named Ruth, who had cooked for mining camps and cattle outfits and traveling families from a chuck wagon for 30 years, and never once apologized for taking up space in the world. Ruth had taught Abigail everything she knew about a kitchen, not just recipes, but the deep, patient knowledge of what food does to people. How it can bring a man back from the edge of something dark. How it can make a room full of strangers feel like a family. How it is, when done right, an act of love that doesn't require anything in return. Abigail's mother had been beautiful and distant, and had died of fever when Abigail was 9. Her father had remarried twice, and had not, as far as Abigail could recall, ever once looked at her the way he looked at her slender sisters. She had learned early the way girls learn things that no one says out loud, that her body was a problem, that it was something to apologize for, that the best she could do was make herself useful enough that people would keep her around for other reasons. She had cooked in 3 different kitchens since she was 17, a boarding house in Bozeman, a ranch outside Billings, where the foreman had been decent and the other workers had been less so, a hotel restaurant where the owner had paid her half what he paid the other cook, because he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, she wasn't exactly the face he wanted greeting guests. She had left each place eventually, not with drama, not with confrontation, just with her suitcase and her coin purse and the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided that endurance was not the same thing as acceptance. Ethan Caldwell's notice had found her at a low moment. She had been sitting at a table in a Bozeman boarding house, counting what was left of her savings, calculating how many weeks she had before the counting became critical. The newspaper had been left by another boarder. She had read the notice twice, then a third time. And then she had taken out her writing paper and composed a letter that was short and direct, and did not waste a single word on apology. She told him she had 12 years of experience cooking for large groups. She told him she knew preservation and curing and baking and camp cooking. She told him her references were available upon request. She did not tell him what she looked like. She figured if that was going to be a problem, it was going to be his problem to raise, not hers to preemptively address. He had written back in 4 days. His letter was shorter than hers. It said the wages were fair, the work was hard. The bunkhouse had a separate room for the cook that locked from the inside, and that if she could start before the end of August, he would appreciate it. He had not asked what she looked like either. That had felt like something. Now she stood on the boards of Willow Creek's main street in the August heat, and the women across the road were still talking, and her suitcase was getting heavier by the minute, and she was beginning to wonder if she had miscalculated the courage this had required of her. Then she heard boots on the boards behind her. Unhurried, even. The walk of a man who did not feel the need to announce himself. She turned. Ethan Caldwell was taller than she had imagined. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar beneath a weathered tan hat, a short beard that was getting longer than he probably intended, and the kind of face that comes from years of working outdoors, angular and deeply lined around the eyes, not unpleasantly so. He wore a brown leather vest over a white cotton shirt, and there was dust on everything below his belt buckle, which told her he had ridden in rather than driven. He stopped about 3 feet from her, looked at her the way a man looks when he's taking stock without being rude about it, and then he removed his hat. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low and measured. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Controlled. "Yes, sir," she said. He nodded, looking at her suitcase and then back at her face. "Ethan Caldwell. I'm glad the stage ran on time." He glanced up at the sky. Another hour of this heat, and you'd have been waiting in miserable circumstances. She studied him for a moment. He had not blinked at the sight of her. He had not checked to see if anyone was watching him talk to her. He had simply taken off his hat and said her name and kept his eyes on her face. It was such a small thing. It nearly undid her. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "I want to be straightforward with you before we go any further because I think it's better for both of us." "All right," he said. She squared her shoulders. Across the street, the women had stopped pretending not to watch. "I'm aware that my letter didn't give you a full picture of the situation. I know what I look like. I know what people say about women who look like me, and I know that your ranch hands are likely going to have opinions." She kept her voice level and clear. "I'm telling you now so you can make an informed decision, and I don't have to find out in 2 weeks that you've changed your mind. It's a long way back to Bozeman, and I'd rather know now." Ethan Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "I posted that notice because my last cook quit in April, and I've got 14 men eating salt pork and hardtack and getting meaner about it by the week. I need someone who can keep that kitchen running and keep those men fed without burning the place down." He put his hat back on. "I don't recall putting anything in the notice about what the cook was supposed to look like." "No," she said. "You didn't. Then I'm not sure what decision you think I need to make." He picked up her suitcase before she could say anything else. "The wagon's around the corner. It's about 6 miles out to the ranch." She stood there for one more second, absorbing the fact that it had been that simple. That he had just picked up her bag and started walking. That was the moment Abigail Whitmore made a decision of her own. She was going to do the best work of her life at Caldwell Ranch. She was going to prove that she was worth every penny of those wages and then some. And she was not going to let herself imagine even for a single foolish second that the man walking ahead of her with her suitcase meant anything by his directness, other than that he was a practical man who needed a cook. She picked up her skirts and followed him around the corner. Behind her across the street, Mrs. Holt said something to the woman beside her. Abigail didn't hear what it was, and she had decided very deliberately not to care. The Caldwell Ranch was not what she had expected, and exactly what she should have expected. It was large, Genuinely large, the kind of operation that had been built over decades and showed its age in every fence post and every weathered board of the main barn. The main house was 2 stories, solid framed and serious, with a wide porch across the front that might have been welcoming once, but currently held a collection of saddle equipment that suggested no one had sat on it socially in some time. There was a cookhouse separate from the main house connected by a covered walkway. This was where she would work. Ethan showed her through it without commentary, which was either a mark of trust or a mark of indifference, and she wasn't certain which yet. There was a long iron stove that needed its grates cleaned, a work table that needed scrubbing, a pantry that held reasonable provisions. Once she started actually looking, and off the back, a small room with a cot, a washstand, a window, and a door that locked from the inside. "This is yours," Ethan said. "You'll have the cookhouse to yourself most of the time. The men eat at 6 noon and 6. When roundup season hits, those times flex, but I'll let you know in advance." "That's fine," she said. She was already looking at the pantry, calculating. "Any questions?" She turned around. "Do you have a kitchen garden?" He blinked. "There's a plot. No one's kept it up since April. I'd like to put it back in order when I have time. It's cheaper than buying everything from town, and the food keeps better." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's your call," he said. "Whatever you need." He left her to it. She stood alone in the cookhouse for a moment, listening to the ranch sounds coming through the walls, the horses, the distant voices of men, the creak of something large settling in the heat. She breathed in, wood smoke and old grease and dry air. Then she pulled on her work apron, rolled up her sleeves, and started cleaning the stove. She met the ranch hands at supper. There were 14 of them, as Ethan had said, ranging from a boy of about 16, who clearly didn't know what to do with his hands yet, to a grizzled man in his 50s named Walt, who had been riding for Caldwell longer than some of the younger men had been alive. They filed into the cookhouse dining room in the way men file into rooms when they've been told something new is happening, and they haven't decided yet how they feel about it. They saw her. The silence was of a particular flavor she recognized. Not hostile, not quite. More like a collective recalibration. Like a room of people who had expected one thing and gotten something different, and were working out what that meant. One of them, a younger man with straw-colored hair and a smirk that sat too easy on his face, the kind of smirk that had probably gotten him applause from other men his whole life, looked at her and then looked at the man beside him and let out a low sound that was not quite a laugh. "Well," he said, and he left the rest of it deliberately unfinished. Walt, the older man, shot him a look. "Sit down, Denny." Denny sat down, but he was still smiling. Abigail set the pot of beef stew on the table. She had been cooking since the moment Ethan left her alone in the cookhouse, had assessed the pantry. Rebuilt the fire in the stove, found a decent cut of beef, and a good collection of root vegetables, and produced something that smelled, she was fairly sure, considerably better than salt pork and hardtack. She set out the bread. She had baked a plain white loaf. Nothing fancy, but good and hot, and then she stood at the end of the table and looked at the room. "I'm Abigail Whitmore," she said. "I'm your new cook. I'll have food on this table at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. I'll do what I can to make it worth sitting down for." She paused. "I have one rule in my kitchen. You clear your own plates. Everything else I'll handle." Nobody said anything. Then the 16-year-old boy, whose name turned out to be Tommy, reached for the bread with both hands and said honestly, and without any sophistication whatsoever, "Lord, that smells good." Somebody laughed. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted into something more manageable, and Abigail went back to the stove and let the food do what food does. She listened to them talk while she worked. That was a skill she had developed over years, the ability to absorb conversations without participating in them, to understand a room's character from the way its occupants talked about absent people and small frustrations and the work of the day. She learned that Walt had ridden for Ethan's father before Ethan took over the ranch. She learned that Tommy was Walt's nephew and had been brought on this spring. She learned that the man with the straw-colored hair, Denny, was good with horses and knew it, and used that knowledge as currency. She learned that 2 of the older hands, a pair named Cole and Hector, had been together so long they finished each other's sentences without noticing. She did not learn much about Ethan Caldwell. They talked around him the way people talk around the weather, referencing it constantly, explaining it, but never really engaging with it as something that could be talked to. When supper was done, and the men had pushed back from the table, there was something in the room she hadn't expected. Satisfaction. The specific physical satisfaction of men who have eaten a real meal after months of enduring a bad one. Walt stopped at the end of the table and looked at her directly. His face was the kind of face that didn't waste expressions. "Best food this ranch has seen in 5 months," he said. And then he walked out. Denny walked out without saying anything. She noticed that too. She was washing the last of the pots when she heard the cookhouse door and turned to find Ethan Caldwell standing in the frame. He was still in his riding clothes hat, pushed back on his head, and he looked like a man who had been moving from one task to the next since before sunrise and hadn't stopped yet. He looked at the clean table, the organized kitchen, the stack of scrubbed pots. "How was it?" he said. "Fine," she said. "They ate everything." "Walt tell you it was good?" "He did." Ethan nodded, something almost like relief crossing his face. "Walt doesn't say things unless he means them." "I gathered that." She dried her hands on her apron. "I'll need to go over the pantry inventory with you when you have a few minutes. There are some things I'd like to order from town, and some things I can put off if the budget is tight." "I'll make time tomorrow morning," he said. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something careful in his expression that she couldn't parse yet. "You didn't have to start tonight. You just got off a stage." "The men needed feeding," she said simply. He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Whitmore," and pulled the door shut behind him. She stood alone in her clean kitchen and breathed out slowly. One day. That was all she had to get through at a time. The next 2 weeks passed in the way hard work passes quickly at the surface, and slowly underneath like a river that moves fast in the middle and barely at all near the banks. She settled into the rhythm of the cookhouse before the ranch settled into her. She was up before 5, every morning, had the stove going before the birds started. Had breakfast on the table by 6 without fail. She kept the pantry organized and the fire banked correctly and the work table clean between meals. She baked twice a week and made sure there was always something warm on the stove in the evenings for men who came in late from the range. The ranch hands came around in their own time and in their own ways. Tommy came around first because he was 16 and hungry and had no complicated feelings about any of it. He started appearing at the cookhouse door an hour before supper every evening, ostensibly to ask if she needed help carrying things actually, because he had figured out that this was when she tasted whatever was cooking and might offer him a sample. She let him. He turned out to be genuinely useful when she needed something heavy lifted and had no particular arrogance about being asked. Walt came around in the way of a man who shows respect by doing things. She came in one morning to find that someone had cleaned the ash trap on the stove, a job she had been meaning to get to, and hadn't. She knew it was Walt, because she had asked Tommy if he'd done it, and Tommy had said no, with the transparent honesty of a boy who would have claimed credit if he could. Cole and Hector came around together, as they did everything when she made a chili verde with dried peppers she'd found deep in the pantry. Hector, it turned out, had grown up in southern New Mexico, and had opinions about chili verde that he expressed with remarkable animation for a man who otherwise spoke about 15 words a day. She asked him questions and listened carefully, and the next time she made it, she incorporated what he'd told her, and the look on his face when he tasted it was one she filed away as one of her better professional achievements. Denny remained the holdout. He wasn't openly hostile. He was too clever for open hostility. She had decided he understood that it would cost him standing with the others who had warmed to her faster than he'd expected. What he did instead was smaller. A comment here and there delivered with a tone that was technically neutral and actually wasn't. Remarks about portion sizes made looking at someone else. A whistled note when she walked past the barn that was almost inaudible and almost accidental. She did not respond to any of it. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she understood that responding was what he wanted, and she was not in the business of giving men like Denny what they wanted. Ethan noticed. She was certain of it, though she could not have said exactly how she knew. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not issue public corrections or make speeches about conduct. But she observed that after the second week, Ethan had a quiet conversation with Denny near the main barn that she did not hear and was not meant to hear, and after that the comments stopped. That told her several things about Ethan Caldwell that his public behavior had not yet given her. She had been at the ranch for 18 days when the first real incident happened. It had been a long Wednesday. She had been up since 4 dealing with a problem in the smokehouse, and by early afternoon she was carrying a load of supplies from the storage room to the cookhouse when she missed the edge of the step and went down hard. The crate hit the ground and she hit the ground and everything scattered, and for a moment she just sat there in the dirt cataloging the damage. The crate was mostly intact. Her wrist was not hurt, just jarred. Her pride was a different matter. She heard boots. She did not look up immediately, partly because she was still catching her breath, and partly because she was not ready for whoever it was to see her face right at that particular moment. "You hurt?" Ethan's voice. Close. "No," she said. "I'm fine." "Your hands." She looked. The heel of her right palm was scraped and bleeding a little. She hadn't noticed. "It's nothing," she said, and started to push herself up. He was already crouching down, picking up the scattered items from the crate and setting them back in order. He didn't say anything else. He didn't make a production of it. He just picked things up. She got to her feet, embarrassed in a way she hadn't expected to be, and started helping him. They worked side by side in silence for a moment, both of them crouching in the dirt, resetting the crate. And then he picked up the whole thing and stood. "I can take that," she said. "I'm going the same direction," he said, which was a careful evasion of the point, and they both knew it. She walked beside him to the cookhouse door, and he set the crate down on the work table, and she turned to thank him and found him looking at her palm again. "You should clean that," he said. "I will." He nodded. He didn't move toward the door right away. He stood there with his hat in his hand, the way she had noticed he did when he was thinking about saying something he hadn't decided about yet. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honest." She waited. "Is there anything on this ranch, any person or situation that's giving you trouble you haven't told me about?" She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze with the same steadiness, and she understood that he was asking about Denny among other things, without saying the name, giving her the opening, without obligating her to take it. "Nothing I can't manage," she said. "That's not quite what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Outside she could hear the sound of the ranch going about its afternoon business. The horses, the men, the particular rhythm of a working place. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "I've been working in other people's kitchens since I was 17 years old. I've handled situations considerably more difficult than this one." She paused. "But I appreciate you asking." He held her gaze for another beat. "All right," he said, "but if that changes, I want to know." "I'll tell you," she said, and she meant it. He put his hat back on and walked out. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, her scraped palm held against her apron, and tried to name what she was feeling. She couldn't quite get there. She filed it away instead, under the category of things that were not safe to think about in any detail, and went back to work. The garden was her private project, undertaken in the early mornings when the light was still thin, and the heat hadn't yet become something to survive. It had been badly neglected. 4 months of dry summer had taken their toll, and whatever the previous cook had planted had mostly given up. But the soil was good, and the irrigation channel from the creek still ran, and she found seeds in the back of the pantry she hadn't expected to be there. She worked on it for an hour each morning before the stove needed tending. She dug and amended and planted, methodical and patient, the way Ruth had taught her, the way Ruth had done everything with the assumption that care now would become abundance later. She was out there 22 days into her time at the ranch, hands in the dirt, when she heard someone come up behind her. She turned and found Ethan standing at the edge of the garden plot, coffee cup in hand, looking at what she'd done. "When did you have time for this?" he said. "Mornings," she said. "Before the stove." He looked at the neat rows, the planted sections, the careful furrows she'd made. Something crossed his face that she thought might have been surprise, though it was hard to tell with him. "My mother kept this garden," he said. She hadn't known that. She waited to see if he would say more. "She died 12 years ago," he said. After that, nobody bothered. The silence between them was different from the comfortable working silence they'd developed. It had weight to it. She held it carefully. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once, looking at the garden. Then he looked at her, and his expression was one she had not seen from him before, open in a way his face usually wasn't, like a door left ajar by accident. "What made you decide to plant it?" he said. She sat back on her heels and thought about how to answer that honestly. "I believe in making places into what they could be," she said, "rather than just what they are." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded again and took a drink of his coffee and said, "I'll have someone clear the irrigation line for you. It's probably blocked farther up." "That would help," she said. He walked away. She turned back to her furrows and pressed seeds into the earth with her thumb one by one, and told herself very firmly that the warmth she felt in her chest was simply the satisfaction of a practical conversation about irrigation. She was not entirely convinced. 10. The 32nd day brought Denny's last act of small cruelty, and it was worse than the ones before it. She was coming back from the storage room late in the afternoon the long way because she was carrying something heavy, and the direct path had a rut that was difficult to navigate with a load. She came around the side of the main barn and heard voices before she saw the people. Denny, and two of the younger hands she didn't know as well. She heard her own name. She stopped. "Don't know why Walt's so impressed," Denny was saying, leaning against the barn wall. "Cook's a cook. Doesn't matter what she looks like, does it? Well..." He paused, and the pause had a smile in it. "Matters to look at." One of the younger men laughed, uncertain, like a person not entirely sure the laugh was safe. "Caldwell's not going to keep her on," Denny said. "Man like him once somebody proper comes along." "You finish that sentence and I'll want to know the rest of it." Walt's voice from somewhere she couldn't see. Dead silence. Then the sound of Denny pushing off the barn wall. She didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned and took the long way back to the cookhouse, set down her load, and stood at the work table with both hands pressed flat against the wood. She knew what she was feeling. She had felt it enough times to recognize it instantly. It was the feeling of being reminded, just when she had started to forget, that she was never going to be allowed to simply be good at something without someone making a point of what she looked like while she was doing it. It was exhausting. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who is always fighting a battle nobody else can see. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and got the supper fire going. She was cracking eggs when the cookhouse door opened, and she turned expecting Tommy and found Ethan. He looked at her face. He was good at reading things she had learned behind the quietness. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Supper in an hour." He didn't move. Abigail. It was the first time he had used her first name. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it sat in the air between them like something that couldn't be put back. She set down the eggs. "It's nothing I haven't heard before," she said, "and nothing I can't handle." "That's still not what I asked." She looked at him. He was standing in the cookhouse door with his hat in his hand, and his jaw set in a way that said he already had a reasonable idea of the shape of the situation, and was asking her to confirm it so he could do something about it. "Denny," she said. "Just talk." Walt shut it down. Something moved through Ethan's expression that was quiet and deliberate and very, very still. "All right," he said. He started to turn. "Mr. Caldwell?" He stopped. She chose her words carefully, the way she always did when something mattered. "I'd like to handle my own situation. I appreciate that you're paying attention. I do. But if you fight my battles for me, It changes things here. The men will see me differently." He turned back and looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing it, the protection instinct against the respect instinct, and she watched him find the right answer. "Denny's on fence duty for the rest of the month," he said quietly. "That's a ranch decision about workload distribution. Doesn't have anything to do with you." She held his gaze, understood exactly what he was doing, felt something she was not going to name pull at her somewhere deep and inconvenient. "That seems like a reasonable decision," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Enough." "Supper in an hour," he said, and walked out. She stood in her kitchen, listening to the sounds of the ranch going about its evening, and breathed. She was still being careful, still not naming things, still keeping the wall up around the part of her heart that wanted very much to believe that a man like Ethan Caldwell was looking at her the way she thought he was looking at her. But the wall, she noticed, was getting harder to maintain, and the garden was already starting to show green. The green came in faster than she expected. By the 5th week, the garden had rows of actual growth, thin and tentative, still but real. She stood at the edge of it one morning with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the evidence of small daily decisions adding up to something visible, and thought that this was what she had always understood about growing things that most people did not. The work happened underground, first, invisible and private, long before anyone else could see it. She thought that might be true of other things too. She went back inside and made breakfast. The rhythm of the ranch had settled around her in the way that rhythms do not announced, just gradually present. The men came to the table at the right times and left at the right times, and somewhere in the middle of the 5th week, she realized she had stopped bracing herself every morning for the day to go wrong. She was not relaxed exactly, but she was functional in the way of a person who has stopped spending half her energy on anticipating damage. Denny was still on fence duty, and the particular quality of quiet that had followed Ethan's quiet conversation with him had held. He ate his meals without commentary. He cleared his plate as she'd asked. When their paths crossed on the property, he did not look at her or through her, just past her, which she understood as a form of negotiated peace and accepted it accordingly. It was Tommy who gave her the first real trouble, and it was the kind of trouble she hadn't anticipated, which meant it hit her unexpectedly. She was restocking the pantry on a Thursday afternoon when he appeared in the doorway, which was not unusual, and then stood there without saying anything, which was, "Tommy," she said, not turning around. "Either ask what you came to ask, or go find something useful to do." He shuffled his boots against the floor. "I heard something today," he said. She waited. "In town. Walt sent me in for supplies, and I was at the hardware store and Mrs. Holt was there and she was—" He stopped. "She was saying things about you." Abigail set down the can she was holding, turned around, looked at him. Tommy was 16 and trying hard to look older than that, and right now he looked about 12. His face was flushed and angry in the way of young men who have not yet learned what to do with their feelings about injustice. "What kind of things?" she said, because she needed to know the shape of it. That you've got designs on Mr. Caldwell. That's the polite version." He swallowed. The other version was worse. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Cole and Hector crossing the yard talking about something to do with the south fence line. "Tommy," she said carefully, "listen to me. Mrs. Holt and the women of Willow Creek have been deciding things about other people since long before I arrived in this territory. They decided things about me the moment I stepped off that stage. That didn't change when I started cooking good food, and it won't change if I cure every sick man in Montana County." She looked at him steadily. "What they say is their business. What I do is mine. You understand the difference." He looked at her with the expression of someone who understood the words and was working on the truth underneath them. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then, it still ain't right." "No," she said. "It ain't." He nodded once deeply, with the gravity that teenage boys bring to moral conclusions. Then he said, "Can I have something before supper?" And she laughed before she could stop herself, and the moment broke, and she gave him an apple and sent him back out into the afternoon. She stood alone in the pantry and held very still for a moment. She had told Tommy the truth. What the women of Willow Creek said was their business. She believed that. She had built her entire adult life on believing it, because the alternative letting what they thought determine what she thought of herself was a road that led somewhere she refused to go. But she was also honest enough to acknowledge in the privacy of her own mind that it was getting harder. Not because she was weakening, because she was starting to have something to lose, and that changed the mathematics entirely. She went back to the pantry and restocked the shelves and did not think about Ethan Caldwell. She was not especially successful. The twist she did not see coming arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a letter. Ethan had ridden into town in the morning for a bank meeting and come back in the early afternoon, quieter than usual, which was saying something because quiet was his natural condition. She noticed it at lunch, the way he sat at the far end of the table, rather than at the head, the way he ate without speaking, the way when Walt asked him something about the south pasture, he answered in a sentence where he would normally have used 3. She did not ask. It wasn't her place, and she had enough respect for his privacy to know that some silences weren't invitations. But then the ranch hands went back to work, and Tommy went with them, and she was clearing the table when Ethan was still there, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and she understood that he had stayed deliberately. She waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down the plates she was carrying and turned to look at him. "Victoria Harrington is coming to Willow Creek." The name meant nothing to her. She showed him a neutral face. "All right." He looked at his coffee cup. "She and I were—" He paused in the way of a man choosing between several accurate words and not loving any of them. "We were engaged. 7 years ago. It ended." Another pause. "Not well." Abigail waited without moving. "Her family has interests in the territory. Land interests. Partly adjacent to mine." He looked up. "She wrote to the bank. I found out about the letter this morning. She's arriving Friday." "What does she want?" Abigail said. He looked at her, and there was something behind his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not quite, but the particular wariness of a man who has been hurt by something specific and intelligent and has not forgotten what that feels like. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know Victoria, and I know that when she moves toward something, it isn't for simple reasons." Abigail thought about this. Does it affect the ranch? It might. Then you should know the details before she arrives, so you're not working blind. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "That's what I'm trying to arrange," he said. "But I wanted you to know, in case—" He stopped. "In case what?" she said. He was quiet for a long beat. "In case her arrival changes things for you here. I wanted you to have warning." She understood what he was saying. He was telling her that Victoria Harrington was the kind of woman who changed things just by being in a room, that whatever social dynamics had slowly, painstakingly established themselves at Caldwell Ranch over 5 weeks might be rearranged by Friday afternoon. He was giving her the chance to prepare. She realized, thinking about her. She felt something shift in her chest, quiet and deep like a fault line resettling. "I appreciate you telling me," she said, and kept her voice level. "I'll make sure the house is presentable if she's coming as a guest." "She's not coming as a guest," he said. "She hasn't been invited." That landed differently. She looked at him steadily. "Then we'll be fine." He held her gaze for a moment, and what was in his expression at that particular second, she was going to spend a long time afterward trying to name. Then he nodded, put his hat on, and walked out. She stood in the empty dining room for a long moment. Then she went to check on the stew. Victoria Harrington did not arrive Friday. She arrived Thursday a full day early without warning in a hired carriage from Bozeman that had clearly cost someone a significant amount of money. Abigail heard the carriage from the cookhouse and didn't think anything of it until she heard the voice clear and carrying the voice of a woman who had been listened to her whole life and had strong opinions about what happened when she wasn't. "Ethan, you look tired. Someone should be taking better care of you." Abigail dried her hands and did not go to the window. She heard Ethan's response, low and even, and then Victoria's voice again moving closer toward the main house, and she went back to her bread dough and pressed her hands into it methodically and kept working. She told herself she was not anxious. She was not entirely convincing. Victoria Harrington came to the cookhouse 20 minutes later. She was, by any reasonable standard, a striking woman, blonde, slender, dressed in the kind of traveling clothes that made every other woman in 100 miles feel like they'd put on something wrong. She was about Ethan's age, maybe 32, and she moved through the cookhouse door with the ease of someone who had always expected rooms to receive her well. She stopped when she saw Abigail. She did not say anything immediately. She looked the full, deliberate look of a woman conducting an assessment, and then something shifted in her expression that was carefully assembled to look like sympathy. "Oh," she said, "you must be the cook." "Abigail Whitmore," Abigail said. She did not stop kneading the bread. Victoria tilted her head. "What an interesting hire." A small pause. Ethan always did appreciate practicality over presentation. Every word technically neutral. Every word a weapon. Abigail looked up from the bread and met her eyes directly. "Can I help you with something, Miss Harrington? Suppers at 6, same as every evening?" Victoria looked at her for a moment. Really looked the way you look at something that surprised you by not reacting the way you expected. Then she smiled. It was a very good smile. It did not reach her eyes. "I'll let Ethan know I'm ready for some tea," she said, and walked back out. Abigail turned back to her bread and pressed down hard with the heel of her hand. She was fine. She was completely fine. She was so fine she didn't notice for 20 minutes that she had over-kneaded the dough by a considerable margin. Supper that evening was an event. Victoria sat at the table in the main house with Ethan, which was not irregular. Ethan often ate separately when there were business matters or guests, but she could hear them through the wall that separated the dining room from the covered walkway. And the ranch hands could apparently hear them too, because the cookhouse dinner that evening had an unusual quality of collective attention. Walt ate his supper without comment, which meant he was listening. Tommy kept glancing toward the wall. Even Denny looked up more than once. She served the meal and kept her face arranged and listened involuntarily to the cadences without the words. Victoria's voice light and constant, and Ethan's responses measured and infrequent, and she told herself this was nothing that had anything to do with her. Then Tommy leaned slightly toward Walt and said, barely quiet enough, "She's awful pretty." Walt said, without looking up from his plate, "Pretty ain't a character reference, boy." Cole across the table made a sound of agreement that was nearly inaudible. Hector said nothing and kept eating. Abigail served out the apple cobbler she'd made and went back to the stove and stirred something that didn't need stirring for a while. Ting. Ethan found her in his garden at 5:30 the next morning. She heard him coming, the particular sound of his boots in the early morning quiet, unhurried as always, and kept her eyes on what she was doing. "She's going to stay a few days," he said. "That's your house?" she said. "Abigail." She stopped, looked up at him. He was standing at the garden edge with his hat in his hand again, and his face in the early light was tired in a way that was not from lack of sleep. "What is it?" she said. "She wants to discuss a land consolidation. Her family's been buying parcels in this territory for 3 years. The ones adjacent to mine are now apparently enough that she thinks it's worth having a conversation about." He paused. "She's framing it as a business discussion." "But it isn't," Abigail said. "She never does anything for only one reason," he said. "That's not how Victoria operates." She looked at him carefully. What does she actually want, Ethan? It was the first time she had used his first name. He registered it, she saw it cross his face, and he didn't redirect it. "I think," he said slowly, "that she wants to see whether anything here has changed enough to be worth reconsidering." He said it plainly, without vanity, the way you state a fact about bad weather. "And whether I have." The morning was quiet around them, the light still thin and cool. A bird called somewhere past the barn. "Have you?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been asking myself that since yesterday." She held his gaze and then looked back at the garden, pressing soil around a seedling with her thumb. "Well," she said, "you'll have a few days to find out." He stood there a moment longer. "I don't want you to feel like this ranch is—" "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently, but clearly not looking up. "Go have your business conversation. I have breakfast to start." A silence. Then he said quietly, "You're the most self-possessed person I've ever met." She didn't answer. She heard him put his hat on and walk back toward the house, and she sat in the dirt of the garden she'd grown from nothing and held herself very carefully together. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was not going to build something in her mind from the way he said her name and the way he stood at the edge of her garden at 5 in the morning. She was a cook. This was his ranch. Victoria Harrington was coming to breakfast. She got up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went to start the fire. Victoria came to the garden once uninvited, and Abigail was there, and their eyes met over the bean rows, and Victoria looked at the garden for a long moment with an expression that was not quite readable. "You planted all of this," Victoria said. "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said. Victoria looked at it a moment longer. "Ethan's mother kept this garden." He mentioned that. Something shifted in Victoria's face. Not the calculated expressions she deployed in public, but something older and less managed. She looked at the garden the way people look at things that remind them of what they couldn't hold. "She was kind to me once," Victoria said. "A long time ago." She said it like she hadn't meant to. Abigail didn't say anything. She kept working. Victoria left without another word. Abigail sat back on her heels and thought about that, about the way a single unguarded sentence could reconfigure the whole picture of a person. She did not soften toward Victoria Harrington. But she understood her slightly better, and understanding was in her experience always more useful than contempt. The second twist came at the end of the third day. She heard it from Tommy, who had heard it from Cole, who had heard it directly. Victoria had not come to discuss land at all, or not only that. She had come because her family had been approached by a land speculator named Gerald Marsh, who was buying up parcels across the territory and using fraudulent surveying documents to claim boundaries that weren't his. The Harrington family's land was at risk, and so critically was Ethan's. Abigail was standing in the kitchen when Tommy told her this, and something in her went very still. "How much of the ranch?" she said. "Cole says the western pasture and the creek access." The creek access, the water rights. Without the creek, the summer grazing was compromised, the cattle operation was compromised, everything she was standing in the middle of was compromised. "Does Ethan know?" she said. "Walt's with him right now." She was already untying her apron. "Where?" "Main house study." She tied the apron back on. It was not her meeting. It was not her decision. She was the cook. She stood at her stove for 30 seconds with her hands flat on the work table. Then she went to the pantry, pulled out the supply ledger she'd been keeping since her first week. The one with the inventory assessments and the budget notes and the margin calculations she'd done, because it was her nature to understand the numbers of any place she lived in. And she sat down at her work table and thought. She had been listening for 5 weeks. She knew what the ranch cost to run. She knew what Caldwell beef sold for at the Bozeman market. She knew because Walt had mentioned it once in passing while she was refilling his coffee, that the western pasture had been in the family since Ethan's grandfather, and that the creek access had been a condition of the original land grant. She knew that if someone was using fraudulent surveys, there would be records, land office records. The original survey stakes the grant documentation. She knew because Ruth had taught her that the people who took things from others always assumed the others hadn't been paying attention. She picked up her pencil. She was still working at the table an hour later when Ethan came through the cookhouse door and stopped at the sight of her. "What are you doing?" he said. She looked up. His face was tight with the particular strain of a man who has just received bad news and is working out the shape of it. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, remarkably, he sat. "I've been keeping the supply ledger since my first week," she said. "In that process, I've paid attention to the ranch's finances more than you probably realized. And I've been thinking about the land grant situation." She slid the papers she'd been working on across the table toward him. "Walt mentioned once that the original land grant had a surveyor's documentation. Where is it kept?" He looked at the papers, then at her. "The county land office, and I have a copy in the house safe." "Then that's where we start," she said. "A fraudulent survey can't stand against an original grant document if the original grant document is brought before a territorial court. The surveying would have to predate the grant to override it, and it can't because you told me once that your grandfather broke ground on this land in 1841. She met his eyes. Marsh would know that, which means his documents are going to claim either an error in the original or a subsequent agreement that doesn't exist. Either way, there's going to be a paper trail, and the paper trail is going to have a problem in it. Ethan looked at her for a long time without speaking. "How do you know any of this?" he said. "I pay attention," she said. "And I ask questions. And I've been working in places where men like Gerald Marsh walked through the door before. Because men like Gerald Marsh always look for the places where people are too tired or too busy to notice what's being done to them." She held his gaze steadily. "You are not too tired. And you have documentation." Something moved across his face that was more complex than anything she'd seen there before. Not just surprise, but a kind of recalibration, the look of a man who has been seeing one thing and is suddenly understanding he's been seeing considerably less than the whole picture. "Victoria came because Marsh has been pressuring her family too," he said. "She thought—" He stopped. "She thought there might be safety in consolidation," Abigail said. "I know. I've been cooking your meals for 5 weeks, Ethan. People talk in front of the cook." She kept her voice neutral. "Victoria's motivations aren't simple. But her information about Marsh is probably accurate, which means you have a common interest even if you don't have a common purpose." He was very quiet. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the papers she'd given him, the ledger notes, the calculations, the logical scaffolding she'd constructed in an hour at a kitchen table. "Abigail," he said. "Yes. When I hired you, I thought I was hiring a cook." She looked at him evenly. "You were." "I was wrong," he said. He stopped, shook his head. I was right that I was hiring a cook. But I was wrong about what that meant." She didn't say anything. She let the silence sit because some silences were better not filled. He looked at her across the table in the late afternoon light, and what was in his eyes was not gratitude exactly, and not admiration exactly, but something that sat underneath both of those things. Something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. "I'm going to get the documents from the safe," he said. "I'll make coffee," she said. He stood, paused at the door, didn't turn around. "For the record," he said quietly, "what the women of this town have been saying about you since you arrived." He stopped. "I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. It's wrong. All of it. You are the most capable person on this ranch, and you should have heard that before now." She kept her eyes on the coffee pot. "Thank you," she said. He walked out. She stood at her stove alone in the quiet, and the feeling in her chest was enormous and terrifying, and she pressed it down firmly where it belonged and focused on the coffee. The coffee she could manage. The rest of it was going to require considerably more courage. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the cot in her small room with the window cracked and the sounds of the Montana night coming through the horses settling the wind in the grass, the occasional distant sound of something moving out on the range, and she thought about what had happened over the last 5 weeks in the way that she thought about things when she let herself be honest, not as events to be managed, but as facts to be reckoned with. Fact 1. She had come to this ranch to cook and prove her worth as a professional, and nothing more. Fact 2. She had been doing that, and it had been going reasonably well. Fact 3. Something was happening that she had not planned for, had not permitted herself to plan for, and could not continue to pretend she didn't know about. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. She was not naive. She had been told enough times in enough different ways that a woman who looked like her was not the kind of woman that men like Ethan Caldwell chose. Not for life. Not in the way that mattered. She had internalized that message so thoroughly over 25 years that she had stopped counting it as a belief and started counting it as a fact, the way you count gravity as a fact. Not something to argue with, just something to account for in all your planning. But Ethan Caldwell had carried her suitcase in Willow Creek without a second thought. He had sat at her kitchen table and listened to her think. He had said, standing in a doorway with his hat in his hand, "You are the most capable person on this ranch, and you should have heard that before now." She pressed her face into the pillow. She was going to be so careful. She was going to stay so clearly within the boundaries of what this was. She was going to cook his meals and keep his garden and help him fight for his land, and remember every single morning that caring too much about a man who hadn't offered her anything was the fastest way she knew to lose the only thing she'd managed to build for herself, a place where she could stand straight. She told herself all of that very firmly. Then she heard footsteps on the covered walkway, slow passing, stopping briefly outside her window, and then moving on, and she recognized the sound of his boots, even in the dark, and could not for the life of her make her heart behave. Tomorrow, she would be practical. Tomorrow, she would be the cook. But tonight, for just a few minutes in the private dark, she let herself feel it. And it was enormous. She was practical the next morning. She was the cook. She had the fire going before 5 bread in by 5:30, and by the time the ranch hands started moving, she had breakfast on the table and her face arranged and the previous night folded away somewhere private, where it would not interfere with the work. Ethan came to breakfast late, which was unusual. He came in with the land grant documents under his arm and sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking, turning pages between bites. Walt watched him, the way Walt watched everything quietly, from the side filing information away. Victoria did not come to breakfast. Abigail noticed the absence and said nothing about it. Tommy noticed it too and said with 16-year-old transparency, "Reckon the fancy lady sleeps late." Walt said, "Eat your eggs." Tommy ate his eggs. It was after breakfast, when the hands had gone back to work and Abigail was washing up, that Victoria appeared in the cookhouse door. Not to the main house, to the cookhouse. She was dressed and composed, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, like a woman who has made a decision and is going through with it regardless of whether she still feels certain about it. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said. Abigail turned around, drying her hands. "For what specifically?" "For what I said when I arrived." Victoria's voice was even, but not easy. "About it being an interesting hire. I was being unpleasant, and I disguised it as a compliment, and you knew exactly what I was doing. So I'm telling you plainly that it was wrong." Abigail looked at her for a moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" Victoria was quiet for a beat. "Because I spent last night thinking about what Ethan said to me over supper." "What did he say?" "He told me about you. Not romantically," she added with a precision that was its own kind of information. "He told me about the ledger, about what you'd worked out about Marsh." Something shifted in her expression. "He's never talked about a cook before. He's never talked about an employee the way he talked about you last night." She paused. "I wanted you to know that I see what's there, and I'm not here to interfere with it. I came because of the land, that's all." The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail set down the cloth she was holding. "Miss Harrington," she said carefully, "whatever you think you saw—" "I know what I saw," Victoria said. "Not unkindly. I've known Ethan Caldwell since I was 19 years old, and I know exactly how that man looks at something he values." She held her gaze directly. "You should know it too." Then she turned and walked back toward the main house, and Abigail stood in her cookhouse with her hands empty and her chest very full, and tried without any success whatsoever to be sensible about what she'd just been told. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were not entirely steady. Gerald Marsh arrived in Willow Creek on a Friday, and the news of it reached the ranch before noon. Cole brought it he'd ridden in for a supply order and come back with the information that Marsh had taken a room at the hotel, that he'd already been to the land office, and that he had with him a man introduced as his surveyor and another man introduced as his legal representative, which meant he had not come to negotiate. He had come to execute. Ethan heard this in the yard with Walt beside him, and his hat pushed back on his head in the way that meant he was thinking hard and not liking the conclusions. "How long has he got on the filing?" Walt said. 30 days under territorial statute, Ethan said. "If he files the claim this week, we've got 30 days to contest it before it goes to the land commissioner. And if the commissioner sides with him..." Ethan didn't answer that. Abigail heard this conversation from the covered walkway. She was carrying a pot back from the main house kitchen, and she stopped walking and stood there and listened and understood that the situation had just changed from theoretical to immediate. She went back to the cookhouse and sat down with her pencil. She had been thinking about Gerald Marsh for 2 days. She had thought about the shape of his scheme the way Ruth had taught her to think about anything complicated, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. What did the scheme require to work a fraudulent survey, a corrupted filing, a rushed timeline designed to prevent the legitimate owner from mounting a proper challenge? All of that meant that the scheme had a center of gravity, and the center of gravity was the surveyor. A fraudulent survey was only useful if the surveyor who certified it was either bribed or ignorant. If he was ignorant, he was a tool and not a criminal. If he was bribed, he was both, and that meant there was something to find. She put her pencil down. She needed to talk to Ethan. She found him in the main house study with Walt and the land documents spread across the desk, and Victoria sitting in the chair by the window reading something she had apparently asked to see. None of them looked up immediately when she knocked on the open door, and she used the 3 seconds to look at the room, the stack of documents, the maps, the expressions on the faces of the people around that desk. "I have a question," she said. Ethan looked up. "Come in." She came in. Victoria lowered her reading material and watched her without expression. "Marsh's surveyor," Abigail said. "Do you know his name?" Ethan looked at Walt. Walt said, "Cole heard it at the general store. Fellow named Pruitt. Samuel Pruitt out of Helena." "Has he worked in this territory before?" "Don't know," Walt said. "I'd like to find out," she said. "Because if Pruitt has done previous survey work in this territory, there will be records at the land office. And if those records exist, they can be compared against Marsh's current documents. A surveyor who falsifies boundary claims leaves traces in his earlier work methodology, inconsistencies, notation patterns, measurement errors that repeat." She looked at Ethan. "If Pruitt is known at the Helena land office, someone there will know whether his work can be trusted. And if his work cannot be trusted, that is admissible before a territorial judge." The room was quiet. Walt said slowly, "How do you know about surveyor methodology?" "My grandmother traveled with survey crews for 2 seasons in the late 50s, Abigail said. "She cooked for them. I grew up hearing how it worked." Victoria from the window chair said, "She's right. That's exactly right." Her voice had changed the social ease, stripped away something more direct underneath. "My father used that exact argument in a Nevada claim dispute in '78. The surveyor's prior work was the thread that unraveled the whole filing." Ethan looked from Victoria to Abigail. Something was working in his expression that she couldn't entirely read, but it looked like a man coming to a decision. "I need someone to ride to Helena," he said. "Someone who knows what they're looking for." Walt said, "I'll go." "You're needed here." Ethan looked at Abigail. "Would you write down what you're looking for?" "Exactly what Walt needs to ask and what records to request." "I'll do better than that," she said. "I'll write it out as a formal inquiry. Land office staff respond better to written requests than verbal ones. And I'll include the specific statute citations so they understand the legal context." Victoria said from the window very quietly, "Ethan, you really should have hired this woman years ago. Nobody acknowledged the comment directly, but Abigail saw the corner of Walt's mouth move, and she kept her own expression perfectly neutral and went back to the cookhouse to write the inquiry letter. Walt left for Helena the next morning. He would be gone at least 3 days, probably 4. In his absence, the ranch ran on the authority that had been quietly distributing itself among the hands over the past 6 weeks. Cole taking the morning range check, Hector managing the barn, Tommy doing whatever was asked of him with the earnest efficiency of a boy who understood that this was his education. Even Denny, still on fence duty, was working it without the sullenness that had characterized his earlier week. The ranch had changed. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because something slow and real had settled into the bones of it. She was thinking about this on the second morning after Walt's departure, standing in the garden before sunrise, when she heard boots behind her and turned and found Ethan. This was becoming a habit between them. She was not sure what to call it. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. He crouched down at the edge of the plot, not in the garden itself, at the border of it, and looked at the growth she'd put in. "These are coming up well." "Another few weeks, and there'll be something to harvest," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the quality of his silence. It was not his working silence, which was comfortable and functional. This was something else. "I owe you something," he said. She kept her hands in the dirt. "You pay my wages on time. You don't owe me anything." "That's not what I mean." He picked up a small stone from the edge of the plot, turned it in his fingers. "When I came back from the bank last week, I didn't know what to do. I had the documents, and I had the problem, and I had Victoria showing up unexpected, and I didn't—" He stopped. "I've been running this ranch alone for 11 years, since my father died. Before that, even in certain ways. I make decisions alone. I work problems alone. It's the only way I know." She waited. "I walked into the cookhouse and you were already at the table," he said, "already working on it. And I sat down, and for the first time in 11 years I did not feel alone in this house." He set the stone down carefully, the way you set down something breakable. "I wanted you to know that." The garden was very quiet. A bird called somewhere in the direction of the barn. Abigail sat back on her heels and looked at him, and what she said next was the truest thing she had said in a very long time. "Ethan," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it correctly." He looked at her. "I came to this ranch with nothing except my work," she said. "That was intentional. I have been careful my whole life not to need things I couldn't supply myself, because needing things that depend on other people is dangerous for someone in my position." She held his gaze steadily. "I am still being careful. I want you to understand that I am fully aware of what I look like and what people say and what the limits of my situation are." He was very still. "But I also need you to know," she continued, "that what you just said to me is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. And I am not going to pretend it doesn't matter to me, because it does." He looked at her for a long moment in the early morning light, and something in his face was open in a way she had only glimpsed once before that night in the garden, when he'd talked about his mother. "Abigail," he said. "What people say, I know," she said, "but saying it doesn't make it stop being the world I live in." He nodded slowly. Not in agreement, she thought. In acknowledgement. Which was different, and somehow more. "Then we'll change the world you live in," he said simply. She looked at him. "Or at least," he said, "this part of it." She turned back to the garden before he could see her face. "Go have breakfast," she said. "I'll be in shortly." He stood. And then quietly, unexpectedly, he said, "The garden looks like it did when she was alive." She didn't answer. She heard him walk away, and she pressed her hands into the earth and held on. The crisis broke on a Tuesday, and it broke fast and hard, and without any warning at all. She heard the horse first coming in too quickly, which was how she always knew something was wrong before she knew what the something was. Then Tommy's voice, high and cracked with alarm, calling for Ethan. Then boots running. She came out of the cookhouse to find half the ranch hands converging on the yard, and Cole in the middle of them, breathing hard from the ride. 3 of the South Pasture crew are down, Cole said to Ethan, who had come out of the main house with his hat already on. Hector, too. They were working the creek access. All of them were drinking from the same source. Started an hour ago. Fletcher can't stand up and Hector's worse. Abigail stopped walking. Fletcher's been 6 before. Walt said Walt had come back from Helena that morning 2 days earlier than expected with papers under his arm that Abigail had not yet had the chance to read. Could be he just... It ain't just Fletcher, Cole said. It's 4 men down and 2 more looking wrong, and it came on sudden. Not like regular sick. Abigail was already moving back toward the cookhouse. Get them inside, she said over her shoulder. Into the bunkhouse. Keep them warm and lying down and don't let them walk around. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said behind her. The doctor is in Willow Creek, which is 6 miles away, and you need someone doing something right now before the 6 miles matter. She was already inside, already pulling open the medicine cabinet she had quietly and systematically stocked over 6 weeks with supplies she'd ordered through the general store, because she had always cooked for large groups of men, and large groups of men always got sick, and a cook who was not prepared for that was a cook who hadn't thought ahead. Go get them inside and send Tommy to town for the doctor. Go. He went. She worked from the knowledge Ruth had given her, which was the knowledge of a woman who had nursed sick men in mining camps and cattle drives, far from any doctor who had learned that the difference between a man who recovered and a man who didn't was often just time and the right care in the hours before professional help arrived. She knew what creek water sickness looked like. She had seen it before. She knew what to give and what not to give, and how to bring a fever down without driving it too hard, and how to keep a dehydrated man from getting worse before he got better. She went to the bunkhouse and she worked. Fletcher was the worst of them, a man of 40-something, who had been quietly kind to her since the 2nd week, always thanking her for meals, always the last to leave the table. He was gray-faced and shaking when she got to him, and she sat down beside him and talked to him in the calm, steady voice Ruth had taught her to use with sick people. You're going to be all right, she told him. I need you to drink this slowly. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, he said, and his voice was thin, but he was there. Hector was conscious, but not fully coherent. She stayed with him longest in the first pass, getting fluid into him in small amounts, monitoring his color, checking his pulse at the wrist. The methodology was Ruth's. The steadiness was her own. Ethan appeared in the bunkhouse doorway. At some point, she didn't know exactly when she had stopped tracking time and stood there watching her work. She didn't look up. How bad? He said. Fletcher needs the doctor. The others should be all right with what I've got them on, but I want the doctor to see Hector too. She reached for the next cloth without pausing. Did Tommy get off all right? Rode out 10 minutes ago. Good. She heard him cross the room, heard him crouch down beside her. What do you need? He said. She handed him the basin without looking up. More water, not from the creek, from the well at the back of the house. And tell Victoria if she's willing that I could use another pair of hands. A pause. Victoria? She looks competent, Abigail said. We'll find out. She heard him stand and walk out. Victoria came. She was not what Abigail had expected in this context. She came in, pushed up her sleeves, and did exactly what she was asked without questioning it, and without making any comments about the situation. She was efficient and calm, and had apparently spent enough time around ranch country that sick men in a bunkhouse did not unsettle her. They worked side by side for 3 hours. At one point between patients, Victoria said quietly, without looking up from what she was doing, "You're very good at this." My grandmother taught me, Abigail said. She must have been remarkable. She was the most capable person I've ever known. Abigail wrung out a cloth. She also weighed 230 pounds, and was told her whole life that meant she was less than she was. She spent 40 years proving them wrong, 1 meal and 1 sick man at a time. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I think, she said carefully, that I understand Ethan a great deal better now than I did 3 days ago. Abigail did not ask her to elaborate. The doctor arrived in the late afternoon. He examined all 6 men, confirmed Abigail's assessment of Fletcher, adjusted her treatment protocol in 2 minor ways that she noted and agreed with, and then stood in the bunkhouse doorway and said to Ethan within her hearing, "Whoever handled this in the first hours did it right. You'd have lost Fletcher, otherwise maybe 2 others. Creek contamination moves fast if you don't catch it." Ethan said, "I know." He was looking at her when he said it. She was already putting her supplies back in order and not looking at him, and she kept not looking at him until she was certain her expression was under control. It was dark by the time the bunkhouse was settled, the doctor gone, the patient sleeping or close to it. Abigail walked back to the cookhouse alone, and the night air after the long closed heat of the bunkhouse felt like something she hadn't earned yet. She was setting her things down on the work table when she heard the door. Ethan. He stood inside the door and looked at her across the cookhouse, and his face was a thing she had no words for. Not gratitude that was too small. Not admiration that was too distant. Something that lived in the space between those things, and the other thing neither of them had named yet. "I don't know how to say what I want to say," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to say it tonight." "I think I do." He came farther into the room slowly and stopped at the other end of the work table. "Today I watched you save 3 men on this ranch. Men who 6 weeks ago were not kind to you. Men who made you feel less than you were. And you didn't hesitate. Not for a second." She was quiet. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer me honest, same as I asked you once before." "All right," she said. "Are you planning to leave this ranch when the situation settles down? When the land business is resolved and things go back to normal?" He held her gaze with the directness that was the most consistent thing about him. "Are you planning to stay?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had told herself in the dark of her room, about being careful, about not building things that could fall. She thought about the garden and the bunkhouse and the early mornings, and what he had said about not feeling alone for the first time in 11 years. "That depends," she said, "on whether there's something worth staying for." He held her gaze. "There is," he said, quietly, plainly. The way he said things that he had decided were true. The cookhouse was very still. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and full of stars, and the sound of the range settling into dark. "Then," she said, "I'll stay." He nodded once slowly, and something in his face released tension she hadn't fully seen until it was gone. The long-held guard of a man who had been protecting himself for a very long time and had just carefully, deliberately chosen not to. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. "Good night, Abigail," he said. "Good night," she said. He walked out. She stood alone in her kitchen in the dark and breathed. Walt's papers were still sitting on the study desk unopened, holding whatever he had found in Helena about Samuel Pruitt and the fraudulent survey. Gerald Marsh was still in Willow Creek, still at the hotel, still moving toward a filing that would threaten everything Ethan had built. The fight was not over, not even close. But something had shifted tonight that could not be unshifted, and in the bunkhouse under the care she had given them, Fletcher's color was coming back. Hector was sleeping naturally. The other 4 men were going to be fine. She put away her things and banked the fire and went to her room, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she did not have to tell herself to stop feeling what she was feeling. She just felt it. And it was against every expectation she had carried for 25 years, something very close to hope. She woke before 4, not because the fire needed banking or because she had forgotten something for breakfast. She woke because her mind had kept working while she slept, pulling at the thread she hadn't fully followed yet, the one that had been bothering her since Cole rode in with the news about the sick men. The creek access. The contamination. She lay in the dark and thought about it very carefully. Creek water contamination happened when something upstream disturbed the ground. It happened after flooding or after heavy animal activity at a water source or after, and this was the thing her mind kept returning to after significant earthwork near the waterway. Digging, Survey staking. The kind of physical activity that a man conducting a fraudulent land survey might engage in near a boundary line that included water rights. She sat up. Samuel Pruitt had arrived with Marsh on Friday. The men who drank from the creek source got sick on Tuesday. That was 4 days. 4 days from the arrival of a surveyor who had been sent to document a boundary claim that included Caldwell's Creek access. Coincidence was possible. She was not a lawyer, and she knew the limits of what she was thinking. But she also knew in the way that careful people who pay attention always know that coincidence was considerably less likely than it looked. She got up, lit the lamp, and wrote it down. She would tell Ethan in the morning, and Walt with his Helena papers needed to know the timeline. Because if Gerald Marsh had sent his surveyor to deliberately compromise the creek access, to make the water unusable, to demonstrate to a territorial judge that the current owners could not even properly maintain the resource, that was not a land dispute anymore. That was something considerably more serious. She set down her pencil. The lamp threw long shadows on the walls of her small room. Outside, the Montana night was beginning very faintly to gray toward morning. She thought about Fletcher's face when his color had come back, about Hector sleeping, about 6 men who had needed her and found her ready. She thought about Ethan standing in the cookhouse doorway saying, "There is something worth staying for." She thought about the fraudulent survey and the contaminated creek and the man in the hotel room in Willow Creek who had not yet understood that he had walked into the wrong ranch at the wrong time. She put the lamp out. And in the dark, Abigail Whitmore felt the last of the woman who had arrived at the Willow Creek stage stop with a suitcase and an apology for what she looked like quietly step aside. What she felt standing in her place was not softer. It was not the woman who survived. It was the woman who was about to make certain that Gerald Marsh regretted every decision that had brought him to this county. She would make that case at the breakfast table in a few hours. First, she had bread to start. Breakfast that morning was the quietest it had been in 6 weeks. Not the uncomfortable quiet of the first days when the men had not yet decided what to make of her. This was the quiet of people who had been through something together and had not yet found the language for it. Fletcher was still in the bunkhouse. Hector was up and at the table but eating slowly, and the other men watched him with the sideways attention that men use when they are worried about someone and too proud to say so directly. Abigail set food on the table and then set her notes beside Ethan's coffee cup. He looked at the notes, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. That was new too. She had not sat at the table with the men before. She sat now, and nobody said anything about it, which told her something about how much had shifted since Tuesday. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Pruitt's arrival Friday. The sick men Tuesday. The timeline. The upstream earthwork. The possibility, she was careful to call it a possibility, that the creek contamination was not incidental, but deliberate. The table was very still by the time she finished. Walt, who had been listening with his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes on her face, said, "That's a serious accusation." "I know," she said. "Which is why I said possibility." "But you believe it," Ethan said. Not a question. She met his eyes. "I believe it's worth investigating before you dismiss it. If Pruitt was working near that water source in the days before the men got sick, there should be evidence disturbed ground equipment marks, stakes that don't correspond to the original survey lines." Cole said from the end of the table, "I can ride the creek line this morning. Know what I'm looking for." "Take Denny," Walt said. Denny, who had been eating without speaking, looked up at his name. He looked at Abigail for a moment, the first direct look in weeks, and then he nodded once, short and certain. "I'll go," he said. She registered that, filed it away. Ethan said Walt, "The Helena papers." Walt set down his coffee cup. "Pruitt has filed 5 previous surveys in this territory. 2 of them were challenged. One challenge was dropped, the claimant died before the hearing. The other was ruled in the claimant's favor, but the ruling was overturned on appeal." He paused. The appeal judge was a man named Clarence Holt. The name landed in the room like a stone. Abigail said very carefully, "Holt." "Hardware merchant," Walt said. "Willow Creek. Mrs. Holt. Her husband, the woman who had decided things about Abigail from across the street on the day she arrived and had not stopped deciding them since. She did not say what she was thinking. She could see from Ethan's face that he was thinking it too. "That's a connection," Victoria said. She was at the far end of the table she had started eating with the hands 2 days ago, without comment, and nobody had said anything about that either. Not proof, but a connection. "Connections are enough to take to a territorial attorney," Ethan said. "Victoria, your family's attorney, is in Denver," she said, "but he can be reached by telegraph, and he has argued land fraud before a federal circuit judge." She looked at Ethan steadily. "If you're asking whether my family will stand with Caldwell Ranch on this, the answer is yes. Marsh has been pressuring us for 2 years. I came here to see if there was a basis for a joint defense." She paused, and the pause carried the weight of something she had worked out privately. "There is." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Tommy said, "So we're fighting back." Walt said, "Eat your breakfast, boy." "Yes, sir," Tommy said. And then under his breath with considerable satisfaction, "We're fighting back." Cole and Denny rode the creek line before noon. They came back with exactly what Abigail had suspected: survey stakes driven into the ground upstream of the main access point, positioned at angles that did not correspond to the original grant boundaries. Disturbed soil. And this was the part that made the room go tight: a length of iron pipe buried in the creek bank, just above the primary drinking access, positioned in a way that would allow something to be introduced into the water from the bank without being visible from downstream. Cole laid it out on the cookhouse table, the pipe wrapped in a piece of cloth, and nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ethan said, "That's not a land dispute." "No," Walt said. "That ain't." "That's poisoning," Denny said. His voice had none of its old performance in it. He was looking at the pipe with an expression that was simply honestly angry. "Fletcher nearly died. Hector's still not right. That's—" He stopped. "That's a different kind of wrong." Abigail looked at Denny and thought, people can surprise you. She filed that observation alongside the others. "The marshal," she said. Ethan looked at her. "This goes beyond a territorial land filing," she said. "This is criminal. And if Marsh filed his documents while simultaneously having his surveyor contaminate the resource he was claiming, that is conspiracy as well as poisoning." She kept her voice level and her eyes on Ethan's face. "You need the federal marshal, not just a land attorney." Victoria said, "She's right." Walt said, "Marshal's office is in Bozeman." "Telegraph," Abigail said. "Today." Ethan was already standing up. "Walt, ride to town and send the wire. Take Tommy." He looked at Abigail. "You'll write the message." "I already did," she said. She slid the folded paper across the table. "Last night, in case." He looked at the paper, then he looked at her, and what was in his face was something she recognized now, the same thing she had seen in the cookhouse 2 nights ago when he had told her there was something worth staying for. "In case," he said. "I told you," she said quietly. "I pay attention." He picked up the paper, held her gaze for one more beat, and walked out. The waiting was the hardest part. Walt and Tommy rode to town. Cole stayed at the ranch with the pipe and the cloth, and the survey stake photographs Victoria had thought to have drawn by hand before they were disturbed. Denny rode the fence line, not because it needed riding. Abigail suspected, but because he was the kind of man who needed to be moving when he was angry. And this was the sanctioned version of that. Abigail made lunch, made it carefully, made it well because the men needed feeding, and because there was nothing else she could do right now, and she understood that doing what you could do was how you survived the hours when you could not do everything. She was cleaning up when Victoria came to the cookhouse door. "Can I sit?" Victoria said. "Sit," Abigail said. Victoria sat at the work table and was quiet for a moment. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "I want you to know that before anything else happens, in case I don't have a chance to say it properly." Abigail turned to look at her. "My family's attorney will handle the joint filing from Denver. There's nothing more I can accomplish here in person." Victoria looked at her hands. And I think my presence has complicated things enough. It hasn't, Abigail said, and meant it. Victoria looked up. You're more generous than I was to you. You were honest once you stopped being cruel, Abigail said. That counts. Something moved across Victoria's face that was not her public expression, something real and a little raw. Can I ask you something? Ask. Are you frightened? Victoria said. Of what happens next? Not the land business, I mean. She stopped, then more directly. Of him. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. Good, Victoria said. That means you understand what it is. I've understood what it is for a while, Abigail said. Understanding it and knowing what to do about it are different problems. Victoria nodded. He broke my engagement to him because I told him I couldn't live on a ranch in Montana for the rest of my life. I was 25 and I thought I knew what I wanted. She paused. I was wrong about several things. Abigail didn't say anything. He never stopped being worth loving, Victoria said. That's the honest version of why I came. Not for the land, or not only for the land. She looked at Abigail steadily. And then I met you, and I understood that what I had broken 7 years ago had grown into something it could never have become with me. Because you are what this place needs. Not just what he needs, what the ranch needs, what those men need. She stood up. I'm not telling you this to be noble. I'm telling you because I think you still don't fully believe it, and I want you to hear it from someone who had every reason to see you as competition and saw something else instead. Abigail looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Victoria nodded once and walked out. Abigail turned back to her work table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. The marshal's deputy arrived the next morning. Not the marshal himself, he was in the field, but his deputy, a quiet man named Reeves, who arrived with a second rider and a saddlebag full of paperwork and the particular focused manner of a man who did his job without theatrics. He went directly to Ethan, then directly to the evidence, then directly to the creek line with Cole as a guide. He came back 2 hours later and sat at the main house table with Ethan and Walt and Abigail, because by now it was simply understood that Abigail was at the table when things were being decided, and he looked at the pipe in the cloth and the survey stake drawings and the record of Pruitt's prior work that Walt had brought from Helena. The pipe is enough, Reeves said. Combined with the survey stakes placed outside the original grant boundary, this is criminal conspiracy to defraud under territorial statute, plus reckless endangerment. Possibly worse depending on what was introduced to the water. He looked at Ethan. I need to take this to Marsh, tonight. He's at the hotel, Ethan said. I know where he is. Reeves looked at the table. I want the woman who identified the timeline present when I do. As a witness. Abigail looked up. You laid out the case, Reeves said simply. A judge is going to want to hear from the person who made the connection. You're going to need to testify. The room was very quiet. I can do that, she said. Ethan looked at her. You don't have to. I know, she said. I said I can do it. Walt, looking at the table, said quietly, Woman's got more spine than half the men I've known. Nobody argued with him. They rode into Willow Creek at 4 p.m. Ethan, Reeves, Walt, and Abigail. Cole stayed at the ranch with the sick men. Denny, and this was the thing she had not anticipated, rode up as they were leaving and said to Ethan, I'm coming. And Ethan had looked at him for a moment and then nodded. So Denny came. The hotel was at the center of Willow Creek on the same main street where Abigail had stood with her suitcase 7 weeks ago while the town decided things about her. She did not think about that now. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady and rode beside Walt in the way of someone who has a job to do and is doing it. They found Marsh in the hotel dining room. He was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone large and loud the way villains are imagined. Gerald Marsh was neither. He was a slender man of maybe 50 with careful eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career calculating. He had Pruitt with him, and his legal man, and 2 others she didn't know. He looked at Reeves and understood immediately what the visit was. "Deputy," he said. His voice was controlled. "This is unexpected." "I expect it is," Reeves said. He set the cloth-wrapped pipe on the table in front of Marsh. "I need you to look at that and tell me whether you recognize it." Marsh looked at the pipe. His expression did not change in the way of a man who is surprised. It changed in the way of a man who is recalculating. "I don't know what that is," he said. "That's interesting," Reeves said. "Because it was found buried in the bank of Caldwell Creek, approximately 40 yards upstream of the primary water access directly adjacent to your surveyor's stake line. 4 men from Caldwell Ranch were made seriously ill by contaminated water from that creek between Friday and Tuesday of this week." Marsh looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the table. "That was enough." "Samuel Pruitt," Reeves said, and his voice had changed, not louder, just final, the way a door closing is final. "I need you to stand up." Pruitt stood up. His chair scraped back. He was a younger man than Abigail had expected, maybe 35, and he looked like someone who had talked himself into this, and was now on the other side of it, and understanding the full weight of what that meant. "I was paid to place the survey stakes," he said. His voice was fast, the way confessions are fast when they've been sitting in someone's throat for too long. "I didn't know about the pipe. I swear to God I didn't know about the pipe." He said boundary markers only. He said, "Shut up," Marsh said. "He told me to place the stakes on the creek bank and that someone else would handle the rest." Pruitt said louder, "I didn't put anything in the water. I didn't know anyone would be sick. I didn't—" "That is enough," Reeves said. "Mr. Pruitt, you'll be coming with me." The dining room had gone entirely silent. Several of the other hotel guests had stopped eating. Mrs. Holt Abigail, registered distantly, was at a corner table with her husband, and she was watching not with the easy authority of a woman who decides things, but with the particular stillness of someone who understands that the deciding is no longer hers to do. Marsh looked for the first time at Abigail. He had registered her when they came in, she knew had looked at her, and through her, the way men like him looked at women like her, a quick assessment followed by dismissal. He looked at her again now, and something shifted in his careful eyes. "Who are you?" he said. "Abigail Whitmore," she said. "I cook for Caldwell Ranch." "You." He looked at her with an expression that was trying to reconfigure itself and not quite managing it. "You found the pipe." "Cole found the pipe," she said. "I identified the timeline." He stared at her. "The cook," he said, as if the word explained something, as if the word was supposed to diminish something. "That's right," she said. And she looked back at him, without blinking, and without apology, and without a single thing she needed to explain to him about who she was, or what she was worth, or what she looked like doing it. Reeves put his hand on Marsh's arm. "Mr. Marsh, you'll be coming with me as well." It was nearly dark when they rode back to the ranch. The conversation in the hotel dining room had continued after Reeves had the 2 men in hand statements, taken the legal man for Marsh, turning out to have considerably less loyalty to his employer than he'd been paid to have. Which was the thing about criminal conspiracy that Abigail had counted on. It required everyone involved to hold the line, and not everyone could. The filing at the land office would be suspended, pending the criminal proceedings. The territorial judge had been notified. The marshal would arrive from Bozeman within 2 days to take formal custody. Caldwell Ranch and its creek access and its western pasture were still Ethan's. They rode back mostly in silence, the 5 of them in the cooling evening air, and Abigail let the silence be what it was, not uncomfortable, not managed, just the earned quiet of people who have done something hard together and don't need to fill it with words. Denny rode beside her for a stretch, and after a while, he said without looking at her, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "Not just for Marsh," he said, "for before, for the things I said and the way I was in those first weeks." He kept his eyes on the road ahead, and his jaw was set in a way that told her this was costing him something real. "I was wrong about you. About a lot of things." A pause. Walt's been telling me that for 6 weeks, and I didn't listen, and I should have. She rode for a moment in silence. You came when we needed you, she said. Today, that's what counts. He looked at her then. You believe that? I do, she said, and she meant it. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ethan found her in this garden. Of course he did. She had come there directly after getting back without thinking about it, the way you go to the place that has become yours when you need to stand in something familiar. The light was almost gone, just the last thin blue of it over the hills, and the garden was dark enough that she couldn't see the individual plants, just the shape of the rows. She heard his boots. 6 weeks ago, he said, coming up behind her. This was an overgrown plot with 3 dead tomato vines and a lot of hard ground. 7 weeks ago, she said. I've been here 7 weeks. 7 weeks. He came and stood beside her, not behind her, beside her, and they looked at the garden together in the last of the light. You want to know something I've been thinking about all the way back from town? Tell me, she said. That man looked at you in that dining room, Ethan said. When he found out it was you who'd put it together. He looked at you the same way this town has been looking at you since the day you stepped off that stage. He was quiet for a moment. And you looked right back at him. And you didn't flinch. And you didn't apologize. And you didn't explain yourself. Another pause. And I thought watching that, I thought about how long you've been doing that. Looking back at people who decided something about you before they knew you. How long you've been carrying that. She didn't say anything. And I thought, he said, that I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to carry it alone. The garden was very still. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her, and there was nothing careful in his expression now. Nothing guarded or managed or held at arm's length. Just him. Just the truth of him, offered plainly the way he offered everything. Ethan, she said carefully, you know what people will say. I know what they'll say, he said. I don't care what they say. You say that now, Abigail. His voice was quiet and direct, and entirely certain. I have watched you cook and plant and think and nurse and fight for 7 weeks. I have watched you be more brave and more kind and more capable than anyone I have ever known, and I have watched you do it while carrying a weight of other people's small opinions that would have broken someone with less spine than you. He held her gaze. I am not interested in what those people think. I have not been interested for some time. She looked at him for a long moment. Your hands, she said very quietly. He held them out. She looked at them. Ranch workers' hands, calloused and scarred and very real. She reached out and took them in hers. I came to this territory with a suitcase and $12, she said. I thought the best I could hope for was to be useful enough to be kept on. She held his hands and looked at them and not at his face because she was not sure she could hold both at once right now. I didn't let myself want anything else. I haven't wanted anything else in so long that I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like. What does it feel like? He said. She looked up. Terrifying, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Yeah, he said. It is. He turned his hands in hers and held them back. They stood there in the dark garden for a long moment, holding on, and the Montana night came down around them, and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere in the bunkhouse Fletcher was sleeping, and the garden was growing, and the creek ran clean, and Caldwell Ranch was still his, still theirs. She thought I came here with nothing, and I am standing in the middle of everything. She thought Ruth would have laughed at me for taking this long. She thought I am not going to waste another minute of it. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. He smiled, then a real smile. Not the quarter smile she had been collecting for 7 weeks, but a full one, and it changed his whole face, and she thought she would remember this particular moment, in this particular dark garden, for the rest of her life. Yes, ma'am, he said. And they walked inside together. Bachai. The coffee was strong, and the cookhouse was warm, and for a long time they sat across from each other at the work table without saying very much, which was. Abigail had come to understand one of the most particular things about Ethan Caldwell. He could be quiet with you in a way that felt like presence rather than absence. Most people who went silent left you alone. He went silent, and somehow made you less so. Walt is going to act like nothing happened, she said. Walt always acts like nothing happened, Ethan said. That's how Walt shows he approves of something. Tommy is going to tell everyone in 3 counties. Tommy is 16, he said. He'll have told the horses before breakfast. She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it. The way it came without any of the effort laughing had cost her for years. She thought this is what it feels like to be somewhere safe. She had forgotten. He was watching her when she looked up, and she did not look away. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Ask." "What did your father think of this place, of the ranch?" He looked at his coffee cup. "My father built it from nothing," he said. "He came to Montana Territory in 1849 with $100 and a mule and a letter of introduction to a man who turned out to have left 2 years before he arrived." A pause. "He stayed anyway. He said if the man had been there, he'd have had somewhere to go. Since he wasn't, he had to make somewhere himself." She looked at him. "He used to say that the ranch wasn't the land," Ethan said. "It was the choosing to stay, the choosing every day to build something, instead of moving on to an easier situation." He set the cup down. "I've thought about that a lot in the last 7 years, since my father died, and I kept choosing to stay." Another pause. "I didn't always understand why." "Do you now?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm beginning to," he said. The lamp on the work table burned low between them, and the ranch was quiet outside, and she thought about 7 weeks of early mornings and bread and gardens and sick men and fraudulent surveys and a man who had carried her suitcase in front of a town full of people who expected him not to. "There's something I need to say to you," she said. He waited. "When I got off that stage 7 weeks ago," she said, "I had already decided it wasn't going to matter. Whatever happened here. I told myself I would do my work and take my wages and not want anything I wasn't likely to get." She looked at him directly the way she had looked at Marsh in that dining room, without flinching and without apology. "I was wrong to decide that before I knew you. I want you to know that I understand now that I was wrong." He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "I'm glad you stayed long enough to find out." "So am I," she said. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the ranch and the garden rustled in the dark, and somewhere across the yard the horses settled, and Caldwell Ranch breathed around them like a living thing holding them both inside it. She thought about Ruth, who had built her whole life on the belief that a person's worth was made through what they did not, through what they were told they were. She thought, "I found it, Ruth. I finally found the place." She did not say any of this out loud. She looked at Ethan across the work table, and he looked back at her, and the lamp burned between them. And she thought, tomorrow there will be a federal marshal and a territorial hearing, and a town full of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Tomorrow would come. She would meet it the way she met every morning before the birds, with the fire going and her hands in the work. But tonight she let herself sit still, and it was enough. The federal marshal arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Deputy Reeves had ridden Marsh and Pruitt out of the hotel dining room and into the kind of trouble that men like them never quite believed would find them. His name was Callahan. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a gray mustache and the patient eyes of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He came with a second deputy and a saddlebag of territorial paperwork, and he sat at the main house table with Ethan and Abigail and Walt and went through everything methodically, the way a man goes through something when he intends to do it correctly. He asked most of his questions to Ethan. He asked his most specific questions to Abigail. "You identified the contamination timeline," Callahan said. "Not quite a question." "Yes, sir," she said. "And you prepared the initial written inquiry that resulted in the Helena Land Office records being produced." "I did." He looked at her for a moment over his papers. Not with the assessment she had learned to brace for, not the social arithmetic of a man deciding what she was worth based on what he saw. Just a professional looking at a source. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm going to need a formal written statement. Everything you observed about the timeline, the water source, the sick men, and the logic you used to connect Pruitt's arrival to the contamination event. It needs to be signed and witnessed." "I can have it ready this afternoon," she said. He nodded. "Good." He went back to Ethan. "Marsh is claiming the pipe was planted by Caldwell interests to discredit the survey. His attorney filed a counter-assertion this morning out of Bozeman." The table went tight. Ethan said, "His attorney filed already. At 7 this morning. The man is efficient, I'll give him that." Callahan set down his papers. "Which is why your statement is critical, Miss Whitmore. The timeline you've established is the strongest counter-evidence to Marsh's claim that the pipe was planted after the fact. The question is whether you can demonstrate the basis for your reasoning clearly enough that a territorial judge finds it credible." Walt beside Abigail said quietly, "She'll make it credible." Callahan looked at Walt, then back at Abigail. "Can you testify to this in front of a hearing?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for one more beat. Then he said, "All right." Chunk. She wrote the statement at the cookhouse work table, the same table where she had worked out the original timeline, and she wrote it the way Ruth had taught her to write anything important clearly in sequence, without ornamentation, every fact sourced to something she had directly observed or been told by a named person. She did not speculate on paper. She did not editorialize. She laid out what she knew and how she knew it, and let the logic speak for itself. It took her 3 hours. Ethan came in halfway through and set a cup of coffee beside her without saying anything. She kept writing. When she was done, she read it back twice, made 2 corrections, and then looked up and found him still there, sitting at the other end of the table, going through the land grant documents he had looked at so many times in the last 2 weeks that she suspected he could have recited them. "Done," she said. He looked up. "Can I read it?" She slid it across. He read it slowly, the way he read everything thoroughly without rushing. When he was finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said, not from vanity, just from certainty about the work. The corner of his mouth moved. "You always know." "I know the things I know," she said. "I try not to claim the rest." He looked at her across the table. "When did you learn to think like that?" "My grandmother," she said. "She said the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who doesn't know the difference between what they know and what they assume." She applied it to cooking and to everything else. "She sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was the making of me," Abigail said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about her." She looked at him. Nobody had ever asked that before. Not once in 25 years. She told him. She talked for almost an hour about Ruth's chuck wagon, about the cooking lessons that were actually life lessons, wearing an apron, about the way Ruth had moved through the world with her size and her competence, as though both were simply facts about her that required no explanation. About the things Ruth had told her about men and work and worth and time. About sitting at Ruth's kitchen table at 14 crying over something a girl at school had said, and Ruth putting a cup of tea in front of her and saying, "Baby, there are 2 kinds of people in this world, the ones who decide what you're worth and the ones who earn the right to know. Don't waste a tear on the first kind." When she was done talking, the cookhouse was very quiet. Ethan was looking at her with something in his face that she had no precise word for. Something that was not the sharp edge of attraction, or the warmth of gratitude, but something slower and deeper, the kind of feeling that takes time to accumulate and does not arrive without having earned its place. "She'd have liked you," Abigail said. "I hope so," he said. "Because I intend to deserve that." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "All of it. What I said in the garden. I meant every word." "I know you did," she said. "That's what I'm still working out how to hold on to." "Then hold on to this," he said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, flat and steady and entirely without performance. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. And we'll work the rest of it out one morning at a time. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought, Ruth, you told me to wait for the one who earned the right to know. I think he's earning it. One morning at a time, she said. He squeezed her hand once. Then he picked up the land documents and went back to reading, and she picked up her pen and signed the statement, and the cookhouse was warm and quiet and entirely, completely right. Tit. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out in Billings, before a territorial circuit judge named Morrison, who had a reputation for impatience with land fraud, and a longer reputation for impatience with attorneys who wasted his time. In those 2 weeks, Caldwell Ranch went on. Fletcher came back to full work on a Thursday thinner than before, and quieter in a way he hadn't been, and the first morning he sat at the breakfast table again, she watched him eat with the attention of someone cataloging a recovery. He looked up and caught her watching and said, Miss Whitmore, I owe you my life. You owe me a clean plate, she said, which I see you're managing fine. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard Fletcher laugh, and it sounded like a man rediscovering that his lungs still worked properly. Hector recovered more slowly, but he recovered. By the end of the first week, he was back in the barn moving at 3/4 speed, and he brought her a bundle of dried chili peppers one morning without explanation, and set them on the work table and walked out, which she understood was the highest form of gratitude Hector was capable of expressing. She hung the peppers above the stove where they would dry fully, and used the first of them in a stew that made the whole cookhouse smell like New Mexico in the fall. Denny was the change she hadn't predicted and couldn't stop noticing. He had come back from Willow Creek different. Not dramatically, not in the way of a conversion story, but in the smaller and more durable way of a man who has seen something that reorganized something in him and is now living with the new arrangement. He worked without complaint, and without the performance of working without complaint, which is a finer distinction than it sounds. He started saying good morning to her when he came in for breakfast. Not as an apology, just as a fact of the day. One afternoon she was carrying a heavy pot from the storage room, and he was crossing the yard, and he stopped and said simply, "Let me take that." And she said simply, "Thank you." And he carried it to the cookhouse door and set it down and went back to his work. And neither of them commented on the fact that 3 weeks ago he had been a different person doing those same 50 yards of ground. Tommy predictably told everyone. Not everyone in 3 counties, as Ethan had predicted, but close. The story that circulated through Willow Creek, the cook who had cracked the marshland fraud. The cook who had nursed 4 sick men back from crisis. The cook at Caldwell Ranch who had put together the case that a territorial marshal had taken to a circuit judge took on a life of its own in the way that stories in small towns do, shaped and reshaped in the telling until the basic facts remained, but everything around them had been heightened by the collective imagination. She heard the versions of it from Tommy, who reported them with the unself-conscious glee of someone who considers himself a primary source. Mrs. Pearson at the general store said you knew about the water before the men got sick, Tommy reported one morning. That you warned Mr. Caldwell the night before. That's not what happened, Abigail said. I know, Tommy said cheerfully. But it's a better story. Don't repeat it, she said. No, ma'am, he said with every appearance of sincerity and no apparent intention of following through. She shook her head and went back to the bread. The twist that nearly undid everything arrived 12 days before the hearing, and it arrived in Ethan's face before it arrived in words. She was in the garden when he came out, and she knew from the way he was walking, not his usual measured stride, but something tighter controlled in the way of a man keeping something in, that whatever he was carrying was significant. Marsh's attorney filed a motion, he said. She straightened up and looked at him. He's arguing that my original land grant has an error in the 1841 boundary survey. Not the current survey, the original. He's claiming that the eastern boundary was incorrectly recorded at the land office in the original filing, and that the true boundary properly measured gives the creek access to the parcel that Marsh is claiming. She went very still. Can he prove that? She said. He has a document, Ethan said. A letter, supposedly from the original land office surveyor, a man named Aldous, stating that he made a recording error in 1841, and that the correct boundary was never properly filed. He held her gaze. Aldous died in 1867. The letter is dated 1865. She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you have the original survey stakes?" she said. "Not the documents. The physical stakes your grandfather drove when he first claimed the land." He blinked. "The iron stakes," she said. "When your grandfather first surveyed the property himself before he filed the paperwork. Do you know where they are?" He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the expression of a man who has the information she's asking for and is only now understanding why it matters. "The southeast corner stake is under the fence post at the base of the ridge," he said slowly. "My grandfather told my father and my father told me. He drove it himself. He said the land office man told him the original stakes would always be the legal reference point if there was ever a dispute." "Then that is your argument," she said. "The original physical stakes predate any document. A letter written in 1865, 24 years after the original survey, cannot override a stake driven into the ground in 1841 that is still there. And if the stake is still there, its position is the position, and any document that contradicts it is the document that has the problem." He looked at her for a long moment. "Abigail," he said, "how do you know these things?" "Because I asked questions my whole life," she said, "and I listened to the answers, and I never assumed that information was only for people who looked a certain way." She held his gaze. "Get Walt. Find the stake. Document its position before the hearing." He was already moving. Walt found the stake that afternoon. It was exactly where Ethan had said, under the fence post at the base of the ridge, driven 2 feet into the ground iron that had been there for 43 years, and showed it. Cole photographed its position from multiple angles with careful, hand-drawn documentation. Abigail added an addendum to her statement, incorporating the stake's position as a reference point against the boundary Marsh's attorney was claiming. She sent it to Marshal Callahan by express rider the next morning. His response came back in 2 days. The addendum had been received. The hearing date stood, and the circuit judge had been notified that new evidence would be presented regarding the 1841 original survey. She told Ethan at breakfast. He looked at her across the table with the full weight of what she had done sitting between them, and then he looked at the men around the table. Walt, Cole, Hector, Tommy, Denny, and he said, "I want all of you to understand something. This ranch has been in my family for 43 years. I have spent the last 3 weeks watching a woman who arrived here 7 weeks ago protect it better than I could protect it myself. I want that on record." The table was quiet. Walt said, "It's on record." Tommy said, "Yes, sir." And his voice cracked on the second word, which he tried to cover by reaching for his coffee and nearly knocked it over. Denny said nothing. But he looked at Abigail, and he nodded once slowly, and she nodded back, and that was sufficient. She went back to the stove. Her face was entirely composed by the time she turned around. Her hands took slightly longer. The hearing in Billings lasted 2 days. Abigail testified on the morning of the second day. She had been in formal settings before. Boarding houses had their protocols. Hotel kitchens had their hierarchies, but she had not been in a courtroom, and she understood that being in a courtroom was a different kind of formal. She sat in the witness chair in the blue dress she had worn to Willow Creek on the day she arrived, because it was her best dress, and she had not yet had occasion to acquire another, and she answered every question from the territorial attorney, exactly as she had been asked, to answer questions her whole life, clearly in sequence, sourced to what she had directly observed. The cross-examination from Marsh's attorney was designed to make her seem like she was guessing. She was not guessing, and she said so, and she explained the basis for each conclusion with the patience of a woman who has spent 25 years explaining things to people who had decided before she opened her mouth that she probably didn't know what she was talking about. At one point, Marcia's attorney said with a tone that was constructed to sound like simple clarification. "Miss Whitmore, you're a cook, is that correct?" "Yes," she said. "And your basis for interpreting surveying methodology and water contamination timelines comes from cooking experience." She looked at him steadily. "My basis for interpreting surveying methodology comes from 2 seasons of listening to professional surveyors discuss their work, which I had the opportunity to do as a cook accompanying survey crews in the Montana Territory in the late 1850s. My basis for the contamination timeline comes from direct observation and medical knowledge developed over 15 years of nursing sick men in remote locations without access to physicians. My basis for the land grant documentation comes from 12 hours of research at the Helena Land Office records." She held his gaze. "Is there a specific conclusion you'd like me to resource for you?" The courtroom was very quiet. Marcia's attorney said, "No further questions." Judge Morrison looked at her over his reading glasses for a moment. He said nothing, but she thought she saw very briefly something that might have been the corner of a judicial mouth moving. The ruling came on a Friday afternoon. Marcia's land claim was dismissed. The fraudulent survey was invalidated. The 1841 stake position was accepted as the controlling boundary reference. Gerald Marsh and Samuel Pruitt were bound over for criminal trial on charges of conspiracy to defraud, reckless endangerment, and deliberate contamination of a water source. The Holt connection. Clarence Holt's role in the overturned appeal 7 years prior was referred to the Territorial Bar Association for investigation. Mrs. Holt Abigail heard later from Tommy had not been seen at the general store since the day of the hotel confrontation. She heard the ruling at the cookhouse table where she had returned directly after the hearing, while Ethan and Walt handled the paperwork with Callahan. She was making bread she had discovered over 7 weeks. That bread was what she made when she needed something to do with her hands during the hours when waiting was the only available option. The bread was nearly done when Ethan came in. She knew from his walk. She didn't turn around. "Well," she said. "It's done," he said. "Dismissed. Criminal referral. All of it." She put down the bread knife. She stood at the work table for a moment with her hands flat against the wood, and she breathed in and out slowly. And she thought about Marcia's attorney saying, "You're a cook, is that correct?" And she thought about the stake driven into the Montana ground in 1841, and she thought about a woman named Ruth who had never once apologized for knowing what she knew. "Good," she said. She heard Ethan cross the room. He came up behind her, and he put both hands on her shoulders, steady and warm, and she turned around. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the garden the night of the confrontation, without the guard up, without the management, just him looking at her and not looking away. "Abigail Whitmore," he said. "Will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It was the way he said things he had decided were true. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the boarding house in Bozeman and the $12 and the notice in the Courier and the letter she had written that was short and direct and did not waste a single word on apology. She thought about stepping off the stage in Willow Creek and hearing Mrs. Holt's voice from across the street and squaring her shoulders and deciding without fanfare that she was not going to let that be the definition of the day. She thought, "I came here with nothing except my work and the things my grandmother taught me." She thought, it turns out that was everything. "Yes," she said. He exhaled a long, slow breath that told her he had been carrying this since the garden. Maybe since before the garden. Maybe since the first morning he had found her in the dark before sunrise, with her hands in the dirt of his mother's neglected plot. He took her face in both hands carefully, the way you hold something you have been afraid of breaking, and she put her hands over his and held them there. The cookhouse was very quiet. Outside, the ranch went about its afternoon. The horses, the men, the particular rhythm of a working place that knew it was safe, and the bread on the work table was cooling, and the garden outside the window was growing, and 43 years of Caldwell ground ran out from under them in every direction, solid and owned and clean. "Walt is going to act like nothing happened," she said against his hands. "Yes, he is," Ethan said. "Tommy is going to cry." "Almost certainly. Denny is going to say something that comes out wrong and mean something right. He laughed. That full, changed-face laugh that she had first seen in the garden and intended to spend the rest of her life earning more of. Probably, he said. She looked at him. One morning at a time, she said. One morning at a time, he said. And in the cookhouse of Caldwell Ranch in the Montana Territory, in the long golden afternoon of a summer that had asked everything of her and given her more than she had ever known to want Abigail Whitmore, who had arrived with a suitcase and an apology for her own existence and stayed to become the heart of the place, understood fully and without reservation that she had been right about one thing from the very beginning. She had known how to cook. She had simply never understood until now what that really meant. It meant she knew how to take raw things and make them into something that nourished people. It meant she knew how to tend what was growing even when it wasn't visible yet. It meant she knew how to be present in a place, body and mind and whole self, in a way that changed the place by the fact of her presence. It meant that what she had always been, what she had always stubbornly, quietly, persistently been, was exactly enough. It had always been exactly enough. She just needed someone willing to set down her suitcase and tell her so. And Caldwell Ranch, that two-story, solid-framed place built by a man who stayed when he had every reason to leave, tended by a son who chose it every day for 11 years, and found again by a woman who had come looking for work and discovered the life that was waiting for her to stop apologizing long enough to walk into it, held them both. And it was home. It had been home for some time. She just finally believed it.